NBA teams reporting for camp. The season's coming close. Media day happened. Everybody's in the best shape of their lives. Zion might actually be in the best shape of his life. So it's time to get in. It's time to dig in to the NBA best ball streets. Time to start talking strategy. But today we're just going to talk a little bit of NBA best ball 101. Site scoring, tournament formats, the different little quirks, some basic strategy, so we can get a little primer in before we really dig in to draft season. Let's do it. Feels good to be back. Welcome, Erik with the C. NBA best ball, as Matt says, the real best ball. NBA is coming. We're back officially. Mark, Shane says smash that like, and this is funny. No such thing as too much Jalen Williams. Well, there's definitely no such thing as too much Jalen Williams because there's about 14 Jalen Williamses in the NBA now. But it does feel very good to be back talking some NBA. If you're a fan like me, you've been following it, you listen to every Low Post podcast, you listen to all the shows and the latest news and all of that, but there's nothing quite like, the players are back. We're getting a little glimpse into Jimmy Butler's new hairdo. We're seeing Zion looking like yoked Zion and really gets the blood pumping. What I wanted to do today for maybe a slightly shorter show than what we'll do every week moving forward up until the season, and a few other of shows. We'll definitely mix in Wednesdays at about this time. We'll try to do an NBA show, and then I'll try to mix in some more, obviously, to do some drafts and things like that, so that we can get everything covered that we need to get covered before the NBA season gets here. I haven't done a ton of drafting yet, so this is also helpful for me to sort of kick off. I've obviously got rankings up on the site that need an update. If you've been following, you see the continually worse every single day Lonzo Ball news. We obviously already had the Chet Holmgren injury, which is in there, and just a few minor little things that I want to tweak. You will also see up on the website, I do have our core picks up there. So there's 3 players currently, and kind of an honorable mention. Oh, this is the 101 article. We have the core picks here up on the site for subscribers. There will be a lot more content pumping out, as I said, and as I pulled up here. Originally, there is a kind of a walkthrough guide, which I'll use a little bit as a reference here today, talking through kind of here's the basic things, right? Whether and I think it's helpful for people of all experience levels, particularly as it pertains to NBA best ball, because there's a lot of similarities in how you would want to play NBA best ball to, most people play fantasy football, right? Most people that are probably watching this played NFL best ball, maybe drafted in Best Ball Mania or on DraftKings or whatever. There's a lot of similarities in terms of strategy and such that we want to apply to NBA best ball. But there's also a lot of differences. I mean, inherently, the sports are wildly different, right? One, the NFL is largely what I would call an event-based sport, right? You score a touchdown or you don't. You can accumulate points based on volume, kind of, but at the end of the day, if you don't score touchdowns, it doesn't really matter. The NBA is much more of an accumulation sport, and NBA best ball is absolutely an accumulation sport. Now, you have guys who score more points per game, points per minute, and all of that, and that matters, obviously. But, just simply playing more games in a week, a worse scoring player, on a per minute or per game basis, can outscore a higher scoring player. And playing more games over the course of a season, right? Why are players like Kyrie Irving often ranked lower. Anthony Davis maybe ranked lower than they possibly should be based on their per game production. It's because they missed a lot of games, and you have to factor those kinds of things in. So there's a lot of quirks to NBA best ball. And I think it's helpful to have a show like this and then an article like this, even for me when I'm writing it, to go through, just kind of some of the basics again, have a little bit of a refresher. What I wanted to start with here really quickly, we'll kind of walk through some of the site-specific stuff that I think you need to know and think about, and then we'll walk through some of the scoring differences, format differences, roster, kind of basics around not roster construction, but how just even how many players you draft on each site and such, and then kind of just a quick overview of general basic strategy, and then we will be obviously back for more. Tons more strategy talk and plenty of drafting as well in the future. Before we get into that, I did want to say, as you'll see here and we'll talk about in a second, there's basically 3 main sites that you can play NBA best ball tournaments on. Obviously, Underdog, who everyone plays NFL on all year, and other sports, and is playing daily contests and battle royale contests and such. And then there is, of course, DraftKings, but there's also Drafters Fantasy, drafters.com, on both Underdog and Drafters. If you have not signed up for either of those yet, you can use promo code SPIKE and get 100% deposit bonus up to $100. Same promo code SPIKE, same deposit bonus, 100% up to $100 on both Drafters and Underdog. DraftKings, as we see here, site format starting off. DraftKings and Underdog are basically the same format. Tiny little minor differences on the schedule, which we'll get into at a later date, because I don't think we need to talk about that just quite yet. But what I would call playoff, as you see on your screen here, 2 different kinds of formats in NBA best ball: playoff and cumulative. A playoff format is kind of what most of our, people think about with like Best Ball Mania in football, Underdog, and what we're used to, fantasy football, fantasy basketball, right? You play your regular season, you got to advance to the playoffs, and then once you advance to the playoffs, just like in real sports, you got to make your way through the playoffs. You could have the best team in the regular season, but you got to win in the playoffs. Doesn't matter how good your regular season team is, you got to win in the playoffs. On DraftKings, again, DraftKings and Underdog are both playoff formats, and we'll get to Drafters and Cumulative in a second. On Underdog, you have to finish in the top 3 out of your. We see the rules here. I can actually just draw. This is a sample from the rules. The top 3 performing entries in each group will advance to round. Sorry about this. It says round 3, round 2. I think there's a minor typo here. This should say round 2. Anyway, at the end of round 1, the top 3 performing entries in each group will advance to round 2. And then you advance to round 2, and the top 2 teams advance. You advance to round 3, and the top 2 teams advance. And then you're in the finals, right? Round 4 is the championship round. And from then on, in the championship round, just score the most points in that 2-week period. These are all 2-week periods, as you see here. Well, obviously not the first round. First round is your regular season of your league. And then you advance out of there. Top 3, you move on and play in weeks 17 and 18. Finish in the top 2 from there. Go on and play in weeks 19 and 20. Again, against other people who advanced, etc., down to round 4. And that's the finals. Very similar. The playoff weeks are a tiny bit different on DraftKings versus Underdog. But again, the structure is basically the same. You do have top 2 out of your league advances in DraftKings. So a slightly more difficult advancement on DraftKings versus on Underdog. But you get the gist, right? Everybody understands the playoff format stuff. That's not new to anybody. Everybody's probably played in fantasy football or fantasy basketball leagues that have a playoff structure. Pretty straightforward. However, we do have Drafters, which is another site for us to play on, and they are a cumulative scoring format. And what the heck does cumulative scoring format mean? Pretty straightforward. You see there's only one sentence on it. Cumulative scoring. I draft in my league. It's actually 10-person leagues, 10-team leagues on drafters. So I draft against 9 other people in that league. And that from that moment on, once I'm done with the draft, the league I drafted in doesn't matter. I got to score over the entire season, the entire fantasy season, score the most fantasy points. That's it. I accumulate, right? It's cumulative. I'm accumulating points over the course of the entire season, and I have to beat those couple thousand other people with the most points. So it's a little bit, maybe some might call it a truer form of, if you draft the best team, you drafted the best team on drafters. On Underdog, you could draft the best team with all the best picks from over the course of the entire season. But if you get to the playoffs and they rest, which we'll get to that, some of that in a little bit in the general strategy. Players rest, right? Players get hurt late in the season or whatever. You can lose with quote unquote the best team. So understanding those two differences are it's very big, right? For a few different reasons. The main one, which again we'll get into more of some of the super specific strategies later. The main one is that it's not that I want to ignore some of the young, like, lottery ticket flyer type players later in drafts on drafters. That's absolutely, I'm not saying I want to ignore them, but there's a balancing act between, this guy's not going to give me anything for months and months and months. I just listened to, just finished today, the most recent episode of the Low Post podcast. Probably my favorite podcast that exists. Definitely my favorite NBA podcast. And they talk through the Pelicans, right? So you have a lottery pick that they selected this year in Dyson Daniels, who a really talented young player. I'm not even sure how relevant he is for fantasy in general, but he's an example of a player who the Pelicans aren't even expecting him to really see the floor for the first couple of months in the season. He may not even be in the rotation. He's a young kid. He needs a little bit of time to develop, but he's extremely talented. And if something were to happen, maybe he just grows a little bit, over the course of those first few months where he's not doing anything, and gets on the floor later. Maybe, knock on wood, we're not hoping for this, something happens to Zion again, something happens to Brandon Ingram, and the next thing you know, you have this lottery pick who's getting real minutes for the Pelicans, and they're they're playing for the playoffs. This is not a tanking team. They're all in trying to win right now. Maybe you get that guy down the stretch who's helping you. Now, that is valuable on any site, but on Underdog, where I just get me into that top 3, I can take some of these archetypes of players that, like, honestly, I don't need their points. I took a little bit of Jonathan Kuminga last year. We'll get to him. He was actually on my best team. I don't think I used his score all year until I think it was the second round of the playoffs. I actually used his score because he was playing. Some guys were out, and he was playing a lot. He had some big fantasy performances, but he was just a wasted roster spot the entire season. But that had value for me on that team. I ended up needing him, but on drafters, only using that guy for 2 weeks is pretty useless. So again, it's not that those guys aren't valuable, because at the end of the day, having a good young talented player is viable in general. But that's the kind of different balancing act between the two. The sites do have really minor scoring differences. I've got them here in this article. Again, it's already up on the website. It's free. This one's free for everybody to see. And I've got kind of the screenshots of all the scoring specifically from the sites, but there's also just a quick summary, right? So DraftKings has double-double. You get a 1.5 point bonus for double-double and a 3-point bonus for triple-doubles. Not a huge deal, but a little bit of a tiny boost to bigs and players who can accumulate double-doubles and certainly the triple-doubles. It's a little boost, right? If you score 30 points per game, and then you tack on a double-double, it's a nice tiny little boost over the course of the season if a guy gets 30 double-doubles or whatever, right? Underdog, maybe the biggest difference is the second bullet point, which I need to zoom in here a little bit. I apologize. Um, I keep my stuff really zoomed out. I'm weird like that. Underdog has 3 points for steals and blocks. The other two sites, DraftKings and Drafters, both have 2. You get 2 points for a steal and 2 points for a block. Underdog has 3. For those that play DFS, this is FanDuel scoring. So it's a big deal. I actually really like it for some certain strategies, which we'll get into kind of later, but also some certain players who are just not only high and steal block rate players like for over the course of a season, but have that kind of individual game spike game, if you will, potential in steals and blocks. Right. I actually mentioned Anthony Davis earlier. Anthony Davis was a big steals and blocks player. One of my favorites was always OG Anunoby. And he will be probably again one of my favorites this year. The Raptors seem to have a lot of those guys, big on steals and blocks. But you get those guys that just, you get 3 or 4 steals and blocks. That makes up that you get 4 steals and blocks. That's 12 fantasy points when it's worth 3. It makes up for 12 points. It's a huge deal. And then if you can do anything else, right? Some guys can have good games from steals and blocks alone, and then you start to tack on any form of other scoring and peripherals, and it's a pretty big deal. And then finally, turnovers and 3-pointers are the last things. Underdog does have -1 for turnovers, as opposed to -0.5, minus half a point on the other sites. And then Underdog does not have any bonus for making 3-pointers, whereas DraftKings and Drafters have 0.5 bonus. So again, really, really minor little differences, but unique variables for each site that play into kind of some different types of players just being a little bit slightly better on different sites. The rosters are almost the same, but on Drafters, you do draft 2 additional players and you start 3 flexes. So every site, you start 2 guards, 2 forwards. Underdog calls them wings. You start 2 guards, 2 forwards, and a center, and at least 1 flex player or utility. DraftKings, you actually start 2 flex players per week, right? You score over the course of a week, and your optimal team is this: 2 guards, 2 forwards, 1 center, and on DraftKings, 2 flex players. On Drafters, actually 3 flex players. So just another minor difference, which we will get into when we dive into in the future some really hyper-specific Drafters stuff. So that pretty much covers, honestly, about all the basics that you really need to know from a scoring, from a site perspective, how the game works. And so for another 10 or 15 minutes, I wanted to talk about some really basic general strategy, because you get a lot of people. I just realized there was a typo in this. Pisses me off. I'm a stickler for the typos and such. So now I see it and it's going to bug me. I have to scroll down because it's going to bug me the entire time. But so you'll get, people want to get into NBA best ball. Like, how do I start? Like, how, other than rankings and having players that we have, right? All that is important. Doing rankings, identifying players you believe to project higher than the market or have the upside. I'm both simultaneously on the, having projections to see who kind of projects better based on where their ADP is, but probably more so for me, it is the guys who maybe not only project better, but project to be able to blow up the season from an upside perspective, whether that be they're just young, talented, ascending players, and or they're stepping into more opportunity this year or have the potential to step into more opportunity this year. A couple of examples last year would be I think my highest owned player, or one of my highest owned players, was DeJounte Murray. And I think he kind of encapsulates all of that, which is the dream of what we're looking for. Hyper productive player when he's on the floor, has always been. Even when the Spurs used to have DeRozan and some of these guys, Murray was an extremely productive player. Then the team is kind of tanking, right? And he's now the alpha on this team, and he's a young and ascending player. Do those players always hit like Murray did? Of course not. But you get this combination of those types of players, and sometimes they take that next step, as we kind of saw DJ do, and you get an absolute fantasy smash in the whatever 5th round, 6th round of drafts. He ended up getting much more expensive by the end, because I think all of us were on that. This Dejounte was not somebody that I'm like, I've been playing this dude in DFS for like 5 years or however long he's been in the league, and I'm not the only one. I'm certainly not some whisperer for Murray. Everybody was on him, but you see the point of why he was perfect. Another one, John Morant. Look at John Morant. A guy who would get picked in the 2nd, 3rd round, something like that last year. And it was just like, look what this potential young superstar could become. Had he become, like, he was a great player previously. Had he become the John Morant we know and love today before last year? No, he hadn't. So kind of the same thing, right? Darius Garland. Now he has Donovan Mitchell on his team, which maybe hurts him a little bit for fantasy. But last year we hadn't seen, we knew he was a talented young player, but we hadn't seen him take this kind of a leap from a production standpoint. So these are all the guys, right? Scotty Barnes, Evan Mobley, on and on and on. You get the point. But exactly as Mark says, you're chasing ceiling. And when you can get the kind of the combination of the two, right? From a median perspective, Ja, DJ, Scotty Barnes, all those guys looked good from a median perspective too. But then they have this crazy ceiling, right? So that's what when you're comparing guys, when you can get Ja Morant, who has a median that looks strong as well. It's what we would call in we talk about this in fantasy football a lot, small loss, big win type players. Ja Morant last year, if he just had kind of stayed who he was maybe not going to win your league for you, but he wasn't going to like lose it for you. He was like a small loss at his ADP, right? Again, we're assuming health and everything. If Ja Morant stayed healthy last year, you were never really going to be upset Ja Morant was on your team. Maybe you wished you had taken somebody else just a little bit better than him, but you were never really going to be upset. But the potential for the win and the upside was such that, like, he's the smash, he's who you want, point blank, period. Because he's a superstar, which he kind of proved last year. And so being able to find that hybrid between the two of them. Erik says, so the olds aren't good in basketball either. I am shocked. Yeah. There are definitely some old players who probably get a little bit undervalued, and that's important for us to diagnose as well. But typically, I would say that old players are probably even more overvalued in NBA than they are in NFL or in other sports. They rest more frequently. They more frequently just fall off the face of the earth from their fantasy production. And then on the flip side, you have the younger players who take that leap, right? And so there's plenty of older players who will be drafting this year. But I think at the end of the day, I would rather try to find the next John Morant or DeJounte Murray or Scotty Barnes or Evan Mobley than go take my 35-year-old guy who, like, I just feel, comfortable with his production, just in general, just in a vacuum. But the biggest point from a strategy perspective to me, when people will ask, like, how do I construct my teams? How many of each position do I take and all of that? And people want answers. Like, tell me that, I'm drafting 16 guys. Does it need to be 6'4", 6 guards, 6 wings, 6 forward, or 6 bigs? And the answer is, there isn't one of those answers. What the answer is it's in quotes here in the second. Wherever your team has a lot of quality players, quality projections, quality upside, you spent quality premium draft picks. Wherever your team has a lot of quality, draft less quantity. Wherever your team is lacking in quality, draft more quantity, right? It's that simple. That's going to change for every team. Did you start with Giannis? Okay. Giannis is a wing. On Underdog. Guess what? You got the dude who laps the field every single year in fantasy on the wing. You don't need to take 6 of them now because you're just getting his score every single week, assuming health. Right now, exactly how many do you draft? That's going to depend on your team. But you don't need to go get 6, 7, 8 wings when you drafted Giannis. Same thing. You draft. Well, we can just get into an example. An example from my best team last year is an example of this. I drafted. Here's the team. It finished 13th in I think it was the small ball, whatever. What? Let me look up. Yeah, the small ball last year, which was really tilting. You'll probably hear me tilt about this at some point as well throughout draft season. Had John Morant, had DeJounte Murray, and neither of them were playing in the final round of the playoffs. But as you see here, I drafted Nikola Jokic and actually only have 2 big men on this team. So I drafted Jokic at the 102. Giannis was pretty much the consensus 101 because he has that wing. It's just such a cheat code to have Giannis. But obviously Jokic was the guy who you really – Jokic was the one of, if not the highest owned player in the finals of the small ball last year. And it was just obviously an absolute smash. He played every game, won MVP, etc. But so I take Jokic with my first round pick. We come back to the 2-3 turn, and I take John Morant, and then I come back with Nikola Vucevic. And so I've started with 2 premium big men. One being the best big man in fantasy, another being a top 10 big man in fantasy. And then John Morant is my headliner at guard. So I have 1 superstar guard. I already have 2 locked in big men. You only start 1 big per week. So theoretically, Vooch is kind of filling my flex already, which I want to win at flex, right? Because if you win at the flex position, you're probably winning, because in order to win the flex, you have to score a lot of points at the other positions. And so I'm locking in that Jokic spot. I'm locking in John Morant at a guard. And now I have Vooch, who's like crushing the flex for me. And, maybe an occasional fill in over Jokic in a week. Maybe he plays a bunch more games, but then Jokic is probably just filling my flex, but you get the point. So I know now instantly after the 3rd round, I'm going to be weak enough at wing, but strong enough at these other positions. And cascading wise, I'm going to be very strong with those 2 bigs. I almost don't have to worry about bigs. And as you see, I didn't. I only drafted those 2. Now, I'm not saying we have to, just because you take Jokic, you have to only take 2, but I think it's a viable thing to do. And it just hammers home this. I was drafting as if I was right about just those first couple of guys, right? I hit on Jokic. I hit on the Nicolas. We hit on the Nicolas at big, and we hit on John Morant. So now I took 6 guards, because I still want to, you still need a certain amount of guards, because the guards are going to score the highest amount of points. And I want the shots on goal, if you will, to find who I ended up finding. DeJounte Murray. I take Murray, and then I actually took Tobias Harris. So I took Murray in the 4th round, and I took Tobias Harris in the 5th round. So my first wing isn't until the 5th round. So I know inherently I already got 2 guards in the first 4 rounds, and I already got 2 bigs in the first 4 rounds. My first wing isn't until the 5th round. And so I'm not saying you have to take your first wing in the 5th round. That's just how this team happened up. I actually have a lot of teams that Bullock is here. What's the equivalent of 0 RB in NBA best ball? To me, it is 0 wing. Wings outside of the Giannis and such it's just a much lower scoring position. So you can kind of like running back, when David Montgomery gets hurt, Khalil Herbert can replicate his production, or replicate the production of top tier backs. Last year, I got this production from Scotty Barnes and from Kyle Kuzma, and sometimes the guy just emerges, right? It's like Scotty Barnes is the rookie at wing going later. I take him as my second wing. He replicates the production of early wings, but you can't replicate the production, generally speaking, of the absolute superstar guards and bigs. Jokic, there's good centers later. You're not going to find Nikola Jokic. You're not going to find John Morant. You're not going to find Giannis is the unicorn at wing, but you're not going to find those guys later in drafts. So anyway, I go pretty guard heavy and big heavy early. And so then, because I drafted, like, I'm right about that, I draft less quantity at big, as you see, with only 2, and 6 guards, and then 8 wings. And some of them were misses. Larry Nance, miss. Darius Baisley, miss. Kuminga, mostly a miss, like I said, until a little bit in the playoffs. But because I took so many of them, I'm just kind of ping-ponging those games around throughout the course of the season and throughout the course of the playoffs, because you got to navigate through those 3 rounds, right? I'm using Harrison Barnes here and there. Kyle Kuzma was who really, Kyle Kuzma and Scotty Barnes, and then, of course, with Tobias Harris. Those 3 guys were really what carried me. But you get a random Kuminga week here. You get a random Precious Achiuwa week here. You get, you get those weeks, and it navigates you through by having more quantity at the position where you have the least quality. And so I just wanted to bring up this team because it was obviously it's my example from last year that kind of successfully employed this basic strategy. Eric asked, "Isn't all that matters games played in the finals?" Yeah, I mean, yes and no. And we'll definitely be getting into a lot more strategy around that. I have something cooking with playoff schedules and just strategy around playoffs and such. But Mark kind of hits on it. It's yes and no is basically the answer. I of course want to target the teams that are playing more games, but also it's not that straightforward. Like I said, Jokic, Giannis, some of these guys, honestly, Murray last year, Ja last year, playing 3 games can be, the guy you need, right? They score 60 fantasy points in all those. That's 180 points. If you have a lesser guard, like I even had Kevin Porter Jr. playing, who was fine for fantasy, playing 4 games, but only scoring 35 fantasy points in those games, is still not going to make it up when you have the super high end scoring. Now, those are the super high end scores, but point being, it's a balance. It's a balance. You don't want to go all in on only the playoff stuff, but you do want to factor in the playoff stuff because playing more games in basketball can allow you to score more points. When you hit on both, that's the dream. A teaser of the core picks. To me, the Kings are kind of a combination of both of those things. They have some nice quantity of playoff games. They are also, similarly to the Pelicans, going to be fighting, whether they should or not, going to be fighting tooth and nail all year to try to get into that play-in. They're playing to win. And to have some pretty productive fantasy players with Fox and Sabonis and some additional guys as well. Sag says, how do you evaluate talent on bad NBA teams from a best ball perspective? I probably take a little more of the talent on the bad, air quotes, bad NBA teams than maybe some other people do. But because if they're bad and you have a talented player, it doesn't matter. Like, I don't lose points because they're losing. The only time it becomes factored in is, if you get the full blown team shutdown like the Oklahoma City Thunder last year. But even then, when guys were out there at the end of the season putting up fantasy points on those bad teams, and those can often be the guys that really help you get through, as opposed to taking the low usage, the PJ Tucker, right? And I'm just using him as the example. There's no circumstance in which PJ Tucker is going to be a smash for fantasy on a per game basis. Can he have a couple good games? Of course. Anyone can. Get some steals, blocks, hit some threes, whatever. But what you need is real, true production. And talent gets you there and opportunity gets you there. And if you can get both of them, even better. You have, like I said, you have shutdown risk. You have all of those things. But that young player on that bad team, I mean, that was and he's not crazy young, but the Wizards were bad last year. Particularly, Beal goes down. But Kyle Kuzma was like my most important player. It's like my most important player because he was just the best option on a bad team left. And when you can get it in that situation where they were still trying to win, again, whether they should be or not, they were trying. And so you just get extremely elevated production. We will definitely talk a lot more about all of this, a lot more about all of this. I promise you. I just wanted to get this first show in with you guys because I wanted to kind of refresh, get the juices flowing, refresh my memory on everything. Click down. I call it the Voldemort saying like and subscribe. We're trying to boost up the NBA best ball space. If you can like this, subscribe. Like I said, be bringing a lot more NBA best ball discussion, both content on the site and here on this YouTube channel. We're about to really get into the groove, drafting teams, talking through strategies, talking through some of the stuff you guys mentioned, and obviously talking some players, man. Like who the hell are we drafting? Who are we drafting? Who's this year's DeJounte Murray? Who's this year's Scotty Barnes? We're going to figure all that out. But that is it for me right now. If you want to come back later, we are drafting some Battle Royale teams for NFL Week 4. Myself, Nez, and Shane. But I will catch you guys next time. Enjoy Media Day. Enjoy the NBA Best Ball Streets. And we'll be back very, very soon.